creation of M.R. James' celebrated lecture on the Abbey Church of St Edmunds. My name's Adrian Tyndall and I chair the research group of the Abbey of St Edmund Heritage Partnership, and it was really in the research group that this whole idea first originated. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight's event, the Bury Society. I'm very pleased to see that we have their chairman, Martin Taylor, here, wherever Martin is. There he is. Thank you very much, Martin, and to the Society for their generous support. Just a couple of words of housekeeping. I hope that you've all managed to locate the toilets, which are out and to the left and straight in front of you. In the very unlikely event of a fire alarm going off, the emergency exits are over there, or you can go out through the foyer, and the assembly point is on Angel Hill, but that won't happen. Can I ask you please to turn off any mobile phones, just so that we can maintain the atmosphere of the 1930s insofar as it's possible. We are going to be taking a video recording of tonight's event. Hopefully that will find its way onto YouTube eventually, so we'll reach a wider audience, and that was really the idea, is to reach as wide an audience as possible. And we may also take some still photographs. If you have any particular objections to either of those, could you please make yourself known to one of the stewards, and they'll try and exclude you from any of that coverage. But if we don't hear from you, we'll assume you're all happy for that to happen. We're actually in a Georgian assembly room, of course, the ballroom of a Georgian assembly room, and one of the roles of the Masters of Ceremony was to effect introductions among the company. And so it's peculiarly appropriate that it gives me the opportunity to introduce Dr. Richard Hoggett, sorry, my old friend, Richard Hoggett, who's going to introduce tonight's event.
Well, thank you very much indeed, whoever you are. I'd like, by way of introduction, to just give you some context to Montague Rhodes James's life and background, and explain how we come to be here this evening. So, Montague Rhodes James, M.R. James, Monty, was born in Kent. He was the youngest of 4 children. But when he was only 3, the family moved to Great Livermere, not too far from here, where his father, Herbert James, served as the rector from 1865 until his death in 1909. James was homeschooled until the age of 11, but after that went to school at the Temple Grove and Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. In 1886, he was elected to a fellowship at King's College and eventually became the provost there, so essentially the chairman of the college in 1905. But in parallel to his college duties, he also became the assistant director of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, rising to the position of director there as well in 1893, a post which he held until 1908. Following a brief period as Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, late in the First World War, James was offered the provostship of Eton College back at his old school, which he took up in 1918, and he held that position until his death in June in 1936. He's buried in the cemetery at Eton, cover your ears, he's buried in the cemetery at Eton, but a memorial plaque to him was unveiled in the Chancellor of Great Livermere Church in the 1990s. Although his academic interests were wide-ranging, James was particularly captivated by the site of the Abbey here in Bury, which of course he'd known since his childhood, and he undertook extensive studies into its history. In 1895, he published a 2-part volume on the history of the Abbey with the Cambridge Antiquarian Society, and that volume remains as relevant today as it was over 100 years ago. The first part of the book presented a reconstructed catalogue of the monastic library's holdings, basically the manuscripts which had formerly sat on its shelves. And this was compiled from medieval catalogues kept by the library and also from James's own identifications of manuscripts he'd recognised in collections across the Oxbridge colleges and other places. Now, this allowed him to identify some 2,500 volumes which had belonged to the monastic library here, making it one of the largest libraries in England, if not Western Europe. But the second part of the book presents a detailed account of the history and the descriptions and the construction and the appearance of the Abbey Church itself and some of the Abbey buildings. And this is derived from numerous fragments, historical fragments, little descriptive passages which James had identified in numerous different manuscripts and which he'd brought together into a single volume. Now, some of those sources were well known, but others were new at the point at which that book was put together. They drew particularly on a volume belonging to the College of Arms, for example, which had in its margins numerous descriptions of the various paintings and biblical verses which were to be found on the walls of the Abbey Church. And also particularly in a lost register of the Abbey, which was found in the public library in the French town of Douai, which contained a list of all the Abbey's benefactors, including some of their final resting places. James illustrated his account with a conjectural plan of the Abbey. And bear in mind, in 1895, most of what we see out in the Abbey gardens today was still buried under rubble. So this was conjectural. And you can find a copy of his plan in the programme for this evening. And on it, he marked the locations of chapels, altars, and notable tombs. And it's well worth taking a look at that plan when you get the chance. Now, in 1901, so again, the turn of the century, James became embroiled in a controversy surrounding a casket of bones held by a basilica in Toulouse, purported to be the relics of St Edmund. And during the construction of Westminster Cathedral, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster had attempted to procure these relics of Edmund with the intention that they should go into the altar of the new cathedral. Now, on the 2nd of August that year, so incensed was James that he took to the letters column of the Times to state that the evidence for the authenticity of the particular relics now in question seems to me personally so remarkably slender as to render caution more than usually needful. So compelling were the arguments which he and others put forward that the planned translation did not go ahead, and the relics remained instead in the custody of the Duke of Norfolk at Arundel Castle, where they remain. In the early 1990s, the bones were subjected to an archaeological research project, which revealed that the bones themselves were derived from a minimum of 12 different individuals, some of them male, some of them female. And although the archaeologists shied away from expressing an opinion on whether any of those individuals might be Edmund, their conclusions effectively marked the end of a debate about the relics which had been started by James some 90 years earlier. In 1902, off the back of this controversy, a local antiquary, Sir Ernest Clark, instigated the Bury Excavation Committee, the stated aim of which was the excavation of the tomb of Abbot Sampson, the great Abbot Sampson, immortalised in Jocelyn's Chronicle, as well as 2 of his predecessors and 3 of his successors, which James had identified as lying buried in a line in the centre of the chapter house. Although the 1902 excavations have become synonymous with James, he acted in an advisory capacity as a member of the excavation committee and only seems to have visited the site occasionally during the course of the excavations, being regularly updated by post, as we'll see. The excavation began in October 1902, and on New Year's Day 1903, you'll have seen the image, the stone coffins of 5 abbots and the uncoffined remains of a 6th were excavated lying in a row a few inches below the floor down the centre of the chapter house, exactly where James had predicted they would be. Again, following the announcement of the discovery, James took to the letter pages of the Times to explain the context of the discovery and the evidence which he'd used to locate the burials and indeed identify them. The skeletons were lifted, studied and photographed before being reburied with due ceremony on the 27th of January 1903. Newly made stone lids inscribed with their names were placed over the coffins, where they can still be seen to this day, set into the chapter house floor. From James's personal copy of his 1895 book, which is now in the collections of the Cambridge University Library, it's clear that he continued to take an active interest in the Abbey site throughout the rest of his life. Scattered through his own personal copy of the volume are numerous handwritten amendments which he made, correcting his text, inserting details of newly identified manuscripts from the library, crossing out others which he changed his mind about, and that he later came to think of as erroneous entries. He published an update to the book shortly before his death. The amendments are complemented as well by numerous pieces of correspondence which he received on the subject of Bury from a variety of individuals, and these he's interleaved into the book at the relevant locations, and they include some excavation plans from the 1902 excavations of the chapter house. But the lecture being reenacted this evening was first delivered by M.R. James here in the Athenaeum on the 21st of April 1932, when James was 69 and had been the Provost of Eton for 24 years. By this time, of course, he'd also become very well known for his 4 published collections of ghost stories. Ghost Stories of an Antiquary from 1904, More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, 1911, A Thin Ghost and Others from 1919, and A Warning to the Curious and Other Ghost Stories from 1925. The collected edition of his works was first published in 1931, so the year before he spoke, and it's never been out of print since. In addressing the Athenaeum, James was following in the footsteps of many notable writers, including Charles Dickens, who gave readings here in 1859 and 1861, and Oscar Wilde, who spoke here in 1884. And James's lecture was reportedly given in aid of the Athenaeum, which by the 1930s had apparently fallen on harder times, no pun intended. It's perhaps fitting that this evening coincidentally also witnesses a parallel reconstruction of an address given in Bury by Charles Dickens. Of course, Dickens wrote excellent ghost stories too, not least A Christmas Carol, and it's a hard choice to make between them, but we're glad that you've chosen to be here with us tonight. We're fortunate that the handwritten text of James's lecture is preserved in the University Library in Cambridge, where it was accessioned in 1954. I first came across the text of the lecture in February 2018 when I was undertaking a heritage assessment of the former Abbey site for the Abbey Partnership. And I freely admit that my hands trembled as I opened the folder in which it resides and realised the full nature of its content, the catalogue having only just said notes for a lecture. Following the discovery, I subsequently transcribed, edited and published the lecture in the proceedings of the Suffolk Institute of Archaeology and History in 2020, and a link to the PDF version of that article is also included in your programmes this evening. Unlike the copyright to M.R. James's published works, which has lapsed, the copyright to all his unpublished work, including the text of this lecture, remains with James's family, and until the year 2038, in fact. And so we're therefore grateful to Mr. Nicholas James, who's M.R. James's literary executor, for granting permission both to publish the lecture, but also to recreate it this evening. The manuscript of the lecture itself is written out longhand in pencil on an imperial bond pad. Much of the text was written quickly and fluently in James's notoriously difficult handwriting, with very occasional crossings through, and in several places he subsequently inserted additional words, clauses, and even whole extra paragraphs into the text. Something of the writing of the lecture can be gleaned from personal letters, which James wrote to his long-standing friend Gwendolen McBride, which she published in the collection Letters to a Friend in 1956. In a letter of the 3rd of April 1932, written while holidaying at the White Lion Hotel in Aldborough, James stated that a lecture has to be written on the Abbey Church of Bury for the 21st and delivered there. In a subsequent letter, dated the 8th of April, so 5 days later, he reiterated that a lecture on the Abbey Church of Bury has to be written when I can brace myself to it, suggesting that little progress had been made by this date. However, on the 26th of April, he wrote from Eton, reporting that I left Aldborough on the 20th for Bury, where I stayed 2 nights, gave a vast, stirring lecture on the 21st, and saw a neighbouring church or two. This stirring lecture was evidently well received, with a lengthy review in the Bury Free Press and Post of Saturday the 23rd of April 1932, under the headline, Bury Abbey Ruins, asking to be investigated. The article described a highly interesting lecture and stated that it was no surprise to find a large audience representative of the borough and of West and East Suffolk present at the Athenaeum Hall to hear the Provost's talk. We hope that 90 years later, you will find the lecture similarly stirring. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoggart. Early and long associations with this town have taught me to regard the Bury Athenaeum as a very solemn and august institution. And I'm quite sure that when I first heard of the similarly named place in London, I assumed that it was merely an inferior copy of this. Certainly, I little thought that I would ever have the honour of addressing an audience here under the kind and worshipful auspices of the chairman of the society of what really is my favourite town. It would be a pleasure for me now to simply dwell upon my affection for Bury, but that is merely a personal matter, and I have to consider the feelings of others. Now, I'm told that there are some of those present tonight from the schools of the town. And this pleases me very much because I have come from a school myself. And I feel that I ought to tell them something which may be useful tonight. Not long ago, on a Sunday morning, 2 Eton boys were coming out of the chapel. One of them said to the other, "Gosh, that was a terribly good sermon." To which his friend replied, "Was it? I don't know. I didn't time it." Now, to those of you who measure the merit of lectures by this same standard, I will give an opportunity of timing me over the course of the evening. The manuscript from my lecture contains a little over 45 pages, each of which will average about a minute in delivery. So now you know something of what you're in for. I'm counting this as page 1. Now, you must not look to hear from me today a great deal that is new. The greater part of what I have to tell has already been set down by me in print some decades ago. But I don't think that matters much, because it is the experience of us all, I think, that people are more inclined to take books as read than to actually read them. And it is sadly true that when you live in a place, you assume that someone or other knows all about the history of it, and someday you really will look into it yourself. Only that day is apt to be in the neighbourhood of the Greek calends, which you will not find in any almanac, still less Whitaker's. Now, at the outset of a discourse such as this, it is difficult to see where one will be led. But my present inclination is not to dwell much upon the beginnings or the general history of the Abbey, nor upon those of its monastic buildings, which we still see the remains of scattered in the gardens, but to concentrate instead upon the Abbey Church and its furniture in particular. But a few facts, which will probably be familiar to many of you, about the fabric really ought to be stated first. So the first church, built by King Canute early in the 11th century, which was at least once described as wooden and certainly a humble structure, was demolished by Abbot Baldwin, and the choir of the new church built by him before 1095, when he moved into it the bodies of St Edmund, Botolph, and Jermyn. After 1102, the sacrist Godfrid carried the work westward on an enlarged plan. After 1119, sacrist Ralph de Hervius built the nave. Samson and his sacrist Hugo, after 1180, finished up the rest of the work at the west end with its chapels and its towers. In 1210, the central tower fell and was seemingly not rebuilt until the 14th century. After 1275, Simon de Luton built a large lady chapel on the north side of the choir, and in 1430, the western tower fell and was slowly rebuilt. Now, 2 other great misfortunes befell the church besides the collapse of the towers. One was the damage inflicted by the insurgents of 1327, the exact extent of which we're not clearly sure about. The other was a fire in 1465, which gutted the interior and probably made an end of the more ancient fittings, although it spared the shrine. So we may think of the church as having been at its richest in the years just before 1465, and it is to those years that my description tonight will apply. Now, you've all seen the conjectural reconstructions of the building. The dates that I've just quoted show that in the main it was a 12th century, that is to say, a Norman church. The total length of it, in the region of 500 feet, places it among the most considerable in England. Now, we have a fine number of fine Norman naves in this country with which Bury was comparable. Peterborough, Norwich, St Albans, Durham. But its close neighbour Ely furnishes perhaps the nearest parallel. And Ely resembled Bury in more than one respect. Both had chapels extending outside the aisles at the west end and lengthening the western front. Both had central and western towers. And both had important lady chapels added on the north side of the choir. But there were important differences too. Ely is a square-ended church, whereas Bury had an apsidal, a round east end, with 3 apsidal chapels radiating from it. And at Bury, the cloisters and chapter house are obliged, owing to the presence of the old cemetery on the south, to be placed on the north, whereas at Ely they were, as is usual, on the south. So we mustn't press this parallel too far. Nave, big west tower and chapels, lady chapel. These are the chief points of similarity. At Ely, the central tower fell, as you probably know, in the 14th century and was replaced by the beautiful octagon or lantern. At Bury, in the year 1400, you would have seen a 14th century decorated central tower with a tall spire of wood covered with lead. And at the west end, a single Norman tower. How finished at the top, we do not know. In 1500, you would have seen some apology for a central tower and an unfinished western one in the perpendicular style. Now, if you stepped out of the church and into the cloister, you would find it very much like the cloister of Norwich, with traceried windows of decorated style. And if you entered the chapter house from the east wall of the cloister, you would find yourself in an oblong 13th century early English building, most likely with a stone seat running around the north and south walls, a rich blind arcading on those walls, a throne for the abbot at the east end, and a lectern near the middle. And if you made your way through a passage near the chapter house and went eastward, you'd come to the infirmary, which was a church-like Norman building with aisles ending in the east in a chapel with the tombs of a number of early abbots. That, I think, is all that I need to say at present about the lie of the buildings, except perhaps that I ought to remind you that along the north wall of the cloister lay the refectory, and adjoining the entrance of the refectory were the stone troughs for washing your hands, which are called lavatories. Over the east walk on the first floor would be the dormitory from which the monks could pass into the north transept of the church for the night services, and over the south, next to the church, I think was the library. But now, let us approach the church and see what we find in it. Well, it has 3 portals at the west end. About the 2 side portals we know nothing at all. But in the central one are magnificent bronze doors, quite unlike any others in England, made in the first half of the 12th century by one Master Hugo. Now, I imagine that these were divided into panels with bas-reliefs of the life of Christ upon them. I mean, you see many doors like this in many places in Italy, Verona, Pisa, Monte Cassino, and at least one pair at Hildesheim in Germany. Now, the prevalence of this fashion in Italy has led to the suggestion that the creator Hugo was an Italian, but on reflection, I do not think that he can have been. I mean, doubtless he was working under the direction of an Italian abbot, Anselm, but we also usually have a Bible with pictures in it by Hugo, and these are certainly not Italian, but English. For the rest, the west front was flanked on the north and south by polygonal towers, one of which may still be seen today, and I do not know of any other English example of this arrangement. Between these structures and the aisle walls of the church, there are indications on either side of round-ended chapels. Now, the records tell us that these were two-storied and were dedicated to St. Denis, St. Faith, St. John Baptist, and St. Catherine. St. Denis comes in because Abbot Baldwin had been a monk of Saint Denis in France and had built a basilica to the saint at Bury, which had to be pulled down when the nave was built on its enlarged plan. Now, I place this chapel on the north with St. Faith over it, with John Baptist on the south and St. Catherine over that. These lower chapels were entered from the aisles of the church, and I guess that in that of St. John Baptist there was a font. Now, you may think perhaps that a monk's church would not require a font, but you see, the townspeople, at least in early times, will have had some claims upon the nave, and certainly on Easter Eve, the monks did celebrate the blessing of this font and go in procession to the chapel of St. John Baptist. It is, however, the received belief, at least in 1753, that the fine 15th century font cover at Whirlingworth was brought thither from the Abbey Church, although I've yet to see any really convincing evidence of this. Now, either in the chapel of the Baptist or very near it was a window illustrating the life of John in about 20 scenes. How do we know about this? And the other windows of which I'm going to speak? Well, this is interesting. At the College of Arms in London is a collection of historical manuscripts known as the Arundel Collection. And one of these is a Bury manuscript containing a chronicle by John Eversden, amongst other things. And on many margins, flyleaves, and other blank spaces, an industrious person, who I think must have been a Bury monk, has noted down about the year 1300 some hundreds of verses which were inscribed on windows, pictures, hangings, roofs and altarpieces, mostly at Bury, but also at Peterborough, St Mary's, York, and elsewhere. And this list, you see, is the source of most of our knowledge about the furniture of the Abbey Church. Now, the window in question must have been a single light, round-headed, and filled with medallions of 13th century glass, which were surrounded with verses written in capitals, Latin verses of the kind called leonine, rhyming at the end or in the middle. Just such windows you can see at Canterbury in the north aisle of the church, and of course a great many of the great French churches are full of them. Now, great ingenuity was lavished upon making these verse inscriptions, especially in England. But as I know myself only too well, they're very difficult to read in the windows themselves. And consequently, at Canterbury, a fair copy was made of them on a roll and hung up for monastic visitors and clerics to read. And since we find the same verses used in different places, like Bury, we can conclude that they were copied by admirers and adopted. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to inflict the actual verses themselves upon you, but I shan't scruple to dwell occasionally upon their subjects, for example, in the window of John Baptist. The story began, as one would expect, with Zacharias and the angel, then the birth and the naming of John, John in the desert, his preaching, his calling Christ, the Lamb of God, then the baptism, to which it seems 4 lines were devoted. Then John was seen rebuking Herod and sending disciples to Christ. And then came Herod's feast and its consequences after his death. There was a picture of Herodias and her daughter piercing the eyes and tongue of John's head with a bodkin. This is a subject that does not appear for a great frequency. There's a story that when they did this, John's head blew so violently upon Herodias that she was whirled off into the air, and e'en now wanders about the world at night with a train of ghosts behind her, the souls of unbaptized children. But in fact, there's quite an extensive mythology connected with St. John's head and body, which I'm afraid I unfortunately do not have time to go into tonight. The last picture in this window was of John being buried by his disciples. So now, remember, we are in the south aisle of the nave, which structurally has 12 bays. By structurally, I mean that there were 12 arches in the arcade before you got to the transepts, but not all of this was open to the public, because the choir of the monks projected into it, and progress was barred on the east by a solid stone screen called the pulpitum. This was, in fact, the regular fashion in monastic churches. You can see it still today at Westminster Abbey and at Norwich. But in many cases, the entrance to the choir has been shifted eastward in later times so that it comes east of the transepts and the screen has been done away with. The restorers, I must say, of our cathedrals have been far too fond of getting an uninterrupted view from the west door to the altar. You can see this fashion at its worst at Peterborough. But now let us look at the south aisle windows of the nave. These were filled with a long life of Christ, no doubt in medallions of 13th century glass. 67 subjects are named. Exactly how many windows they filled, I'm not prepared to say. But the story begins with the Nativity, and it ends with Simon of Cyrene heaving the cross. So it is not entirely complete in our records. We will, however, glance at the subjects. 10 of them relate to the early history, from the birth to the presentation in the temple. 3 to the 3 temptations, 4 to the miracle of Cana, 4 to the miracles of healing and walking on the sea, 4 more to the woman of Samaria. The raising of Lazarus occupies no less than 11, and then comes the entry into Jerusalem and the Passion. Now, it is odd that the Transfiguration and the feeding of the multitude don't appear, but, well, to say nothing of other important incidents. But you see, there's a great deal about humility on the whole, and this is characteristic of earlier medieval art. You'd never find this in the 14th and 15th centuries. There is, however, a complete absence of the parables, and indeed Canterbury is the only place that I know of where these were represented on a large scale. A briefer look at the north aisle will suffice us, because here there were no painted windows in the lower range. Probably indeed there was very little in the way of windows at all, because the cloister abutted on this side. The cloister had 2 doors leading into it. Near the eastern one, as I guess, was an image of the Virgin before which 2 abbots were buried, namely Thomas de Tottington, who was abbot from 1301 to 1312, and his successor Richard de Draughton. Now, of Thomas de Tottington, there is this curious fact to be recorded, that part of his brass still exists. It was cut up and reused in about 1540 to make a brass for one Margaret Bulstrode, whose effigy is engraved on the other side of it. And this is now in the church of Hedgerley, Buckinghamshire, not far from Eton. 2 lines of Thomas's epitaph remain on it, which invoke the protection of the Virgin Mary. Now, there was also on the north aisle an effigy of St. Christopher. As you probably know, the usual place for his picture is on the north wall of the church, facing the principal entrance, usually the south door. I mean, doubtless it was put there in deference to the popular liking for seeing his image first thing upon entering a church. Nowadays, of course, we put him in the car. Was the nave roof vaulted in stone? I'm pretty sure that it was not. The account of the fire in 1465 speaks only of a wooden ceiling. Now, this was richly painted, according to our record, after the manner of that of the choir. And the work was done in the 14th century by the sacrist John Lavenham, who paid £100 for it, but of the design, I'm afraid, we know nothing. As to the clerestory windows, I believe them to have been altered from the original Norman single lights with larger traceried ones in the 14th century. John of Gaunt gave 7 windows on the south side of the church, and Thomas Rudham, we read, made diverse windows in the nave in the same century, and Lavenham did the same for the choir. Windows of the new style in the vaulting around St Edmund. Now, such windows, high up as they were, are pretty certain to have contained heraldry and single figures of saints, not pictures with small figures. But now we will leave the the open part of the nave. The great screen, which now confronts us, has over it a large rood with Mary and John, which was the work of Hugo, the sacrist, under Samson. We pass under this and we find ourselves in the space called latterly, and I think perversely, the retro choir, where old and infirm monks sat and others who were not able to take an active part. Now, I say perversely because retro choir has become a common and perfectly natural name for the part east of the high altar, where the proper retro choir is in fact at the west. Anyway, now we move into the choir proper. This was set up at 80 stalls, the abbots immediately on the right of the entrance, the priors on the left. I don't suppose that the stalls had canopies, and I think that they were backed by a solid screen of wood or stone, the inner side of which was adorned with hangings. Of the outer side, facing into the aisles, there's something to be said. When Samson was sub-sacrist, that is before 1180, Jocelyn tells us that our choir was erected by his means and that he supervised the stories of the paintings on it, and he himself composed elegiac verses. Now, in our Herald's College manuscript, there is a series of about 90 lines said to be inscribed in and round the choir, and I have absolutely no doubt that these are Samson's verses, although they are not elegiac, but leonine. They tell the whole story of the book of Genesis, from the creation of Adam, the work of the 6 days was apparently omitted, to the blessing of Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh by Jacob. And this long series of 12th century paintings was a very notable work of art. There was something comparable at Peterborough, where Abbot William de Waterville, in the late part of the 12th century, had the outside of the stall backs painted with a series of pictures of the life of Christ with types from the Old Testament. Some of these survived into the civil wars, but a record of the whole is preserved in the pictures and the verses of a beautiful psalter, which is now at Brussels, dating from before 1300. Another parallel for this decoration is in the Cathedral of Toledo, where the stone screen around the choir has the story of Genesis and Exodus in sculpture all around it. This was made in the 14th century. If you ask for any other examples of the Genesis story in English buildings, well, I can refer you to 4, which are all in sculpture. Namely, a few early reliefs on the west front of Lincoln, a large series on the front of Wells, a fairly complete one on the chapter house at Salisbury, and one of the 15th century on the roof bosses of Norwich Cathedral. But Samson's in Bury is by far the largest. Now, he keeps very close to the Bible story, only introducing legendary material in the shape of the blind Lamech unwittingly shooting Cain with an arrow. But it's only too likely, I'm afraid, that this work perished in the fire of 1465. There is, however, a puzzle about it, because we're told that John de Northwold, abbot from 1279 to 1304, had the choir made and painted by John Woodcroft, the king's painter. But you see, I cannot believe that all of Samson's work was done away with quite so soon, and I feel sure that the verses are the work of the 12th and not the 13th century. But we must simply be content with uncertainty as to what it was that Northwood did. The inside of the choir had elaborately pictured hangings. Were they painted cloths or embroidered? Who can tell? I guess that they were the former, but they, of course, cannot have survived the fire. Those which are described for us were very elaborate compositions with many different scenes. For instance, on the south, which was the abbot's side, was one illustrating the parable of Dives and Lazarus in 5 scenes, and the miracle of Cana in 4, with a picture of hell torments. Other hangings in various parts of the choir, but of uncertain situation, had a life of Christ in 16 scenes, a picture of Christ as judge, and the birth and sacrifice of Isaac. The stalls came to an end just before the central tower, and west of the transepts. Therefore, the roof of this part of it was uniform with that of the nave, probably of wood and certainly painted. I guess that the main roofs of the transepts were also of wood, and that the stone vaulting did not begin till we reach Abbot Baldwin's work in the presbytery and the eastern chapels. But you see, not a word is said anywhere, I think, of the transept roof or of the central tower. Now, fronting you, as you stood under the central tower, was the choir altar. It had some sort of an altarpiece, but it could not have been so arranged as to obscure the view of the high altar, which stood some way east of it. Behind it, at the western termination of its building, Abbot Baldwin was buried, and in front of it, Abbot John Northwold. And at this point, I think we had probably better take stock of the transepts. Of both, it may be said that they had an eastern aisle with altars in the spaces between the columns, and probably both had chapels with an eastern apse at their ends, where we're sure of the north and the south for this. About the north transept, I really know nothing except that it must have communicated by a stair with the dormitory, and that its apsidal chapel was very likely that of the relics. Also, perhaps the Lady Chapel and the vestry could have been entered from it. Of the south, I can say that in its eastern aisle were altars of St. John the Evangelist and St. Nicholas, and probably also one called of the Black Hostelry, which I take to mean that it was for the use of black, that is to say, Benedictine monks visiting the abbey. Near St. John's altar was a window illustrating his life and legendary miracles, and ending with his ordering his grave to be dug, lying down in it and being buried, and the earth moving above him to show that he yet lived. St. Nicholas, too, had a window of his life, and the Black Hostelry, one with some scenes from the Revelation, but I'm afraid our records of both of these seem to be incomplete. Somewhere here, too, was a chapel of St. Botolph, built by Abbot Northwold later in the 13th century, so an addition to the main structure. Was it in the angle between transept and south wall of the choir, thus complementing the Lady Chapel on the north? Only excavation could tell us that. But leave the transept now and go back to a position in front of the magnificent high altar in what is called the presbytery, which is east of the choir altar. Standing by it is the splendid paschal candlestick in bronze, wrought with images of the creation and the fall of Adam and Eve. This had 7 branches, and it perished in 1465. Over the altar was a beam carved with 13 scenes from the Passion, beginning with the entry into Jerusalem and ending with the incredulity of St. Thomas. Perhaps on this beam stood another rood with Mary and John, made by the great artist Hugo, the artist of the doors, not the later sacrist who made the rood of the pulpitum. Visible behind the centre of the altar was the western end of St. Edmund's shrine, wrought with a gold relief of Christ in majesty. Now, we read of tabulae. They may be frontals, which were over and in front of the altar. One had types on it of the Passion and Resurrection. So the widow of Zarephath holding up her 2 sticks, Jonah swallowed and vomited up by the whale, the father lion raising his cub by roaring over it. This is all very usual. Another tabula had the church with St. Peter and the synagogue with Moses. We also hear of a cross with Mary and John that stood on this altar and had been given by that rather dubious character Archbishop Stigand in or before William I's time. This must have been one of the oldest of the many crosses in the church, but anon you shall hear of a somewhat older one still. Now, we have several other descriptions or other inscriptions of works of art in and about this part of the church. A painted cloth with Christ in majesty, and a curious one, again called a tabula, near the candlestick, the central subject of which was a last judgment. It was Christ, surrounded by throned apostles, the angel of the last trumpet, the dead rising, the blessed and the lost, the latter, of course, whom were being driven into hell. Round this, it seems, were 4 scenes of the works of mercy, and also, and this is very odd, Pictures of coin clippers, wicked lawyers and usurers, first of all committing their several crimes and then being punished for them in hell. Now this has somewhat the air of a penitential offering. No doubt there was more splendour than has been recorded, but now we must pass behind the altar. And here we're confronted by the great glory of the church, the shrine of St Edmund. As I suspect you'll be aware of the general form of this. It was church-shaped, of silver gilt and gold on a marble base, perhaps with figures in panels along the sides of it, crested with gold, hung all about with jewels, crosses and other precious offerings. Above it hung a painted wooden cover, which was raised and lowered by pulleys. And at the fire of 1465, this cover fell down upon the shrine and effectually protected it. So it survived until its defacing by Henry VIII's commissioners. Those of you, perhaps, who saw the Shrine of Santorinus of Evreux at the recent French exhibition, you might now form an idea of the general aspect of this much earlier and far more magnificent work, of which we have many fairly faithful pictures in 2 copies of Lydgate's Life of St Edmund, that in the British Museum and that which recently passed into the Yates-Thompson collection. They're by the same artist, and of course they agree as to the form of the shrine. Now, somewhere near the shrine was a hanging on which the life of St Edmund was portrayed in 11 scenes, and another sculpture or painting, unclear which, with 6 scenes. In both, the vengeance of St Edmund upon the Danish king Sweyn, who was the father of Canute, was dwelt upon at length. Now, Sweyn, you might remember, was exacting heavy tribute from the lands of St Edmund. The monk Agelwin protested in vain, and finally Edmund appeared to Sweyn in his sleep and seemed to smite him with a lance, and the Danish king did not long survive this vision. This was certainly the most famous and impressive of all the miracles associated with Edmund, and it certainly influenced Canute to propitiate the saint himself. Grouped, as I think, about the eastern end of the shrine were 3 more recorded ones of silver. 2 contained the bodies of St Botolph and St Germain. The third in the middle, I suppose some relic of St Thomas of Canterbury, but I'm afraid I know little or nothing about that. Botolph and Germain, however, were very characteristic Suffolk saints. Now, Botolph, I've no doubt, has been successfully shown to be the famous one to whom many English churches are dedicated and who once had a monastery at Icon near Aldborough. Germain was the son of King Anna and brother or nephew of the Ely saint princesses Etheldreda, Withburga, Ermenilda, and so forth. He fell in battle near Blythburgh with his father, fighting against the old heathen Penda. And he long rested at Blythburgh until he was removed to Bury by Leofston in the 11th century. Leofston also brought Botolph from Grunsburgh. Both saints belong to the 7th century. Now, Botolph, Thomas and Germain also shared an altar in this part of the church. But now we find ourselves at the end of the building. 3 apsidal chapels face us. That on the left, or north, is unique in England as being dedicated to the Oriental Saint Saba. Easily explained because Abbot Anselm had been abbot of St Saba's monastery in Rome. He had it painted, but we know not with what pictures. The central chapel was, I have no doubt, originally the Lady Chapel. When the new Lady Chapel was built on the north of the choir, it seems likely to me that the dedication of the old one was changed to that of the Martyrs. I mean, perhaps it was always a chapel of St Mary and the Martyrs. We can't be sure. But it continued to be popularly called the Lady Chapel until well into the 15th century. Now, we have some verses said to be at or by the old Chapel of the Virgin, although they do not relate to her, but to St Martin. I dare say his altar, because he did have one, was between the central and the right-hand chapels. Now, there are plenty of verses in our manuscript relating to the Virgin and her miracles, but these are more likely to have been in the new chapel. The right-hand chapel was that of the Holy Cross. Whether it had always been so, or whether at one time St. Peter's altar was in it, I have my doubts. At any rate, we're sure of its name in the 13th century, and two very holy crosses indeed are spoken of in connection with it. I imagine that they were both kept there. One was a copy of the Cross of Lucca. Now, two abbots had been to Lucca, Leofstan, who was credited with the gift of the cross, and Baldwin, who gave some relics to the city, and probably enough also gave to the chapter the two manuscripts of Abbo's Passion of St Edmund, which it still has. Now, the Cross of Lucca is more usually known as the Holy Face, Santo Volto. By the Holy Face of Lucca was William Rufus's favourite oath. It was the crucifix, robed and crowned, which was said to have been carved by Nicodemus. You see it not infrequently, copies of it in the 12th century. There's one at Amiens, for instance, and another at Beauvais. And one or other of those, I forget which, is now called an image of St. Wilgefortz, because you see, this robed and crowned figure was, in the late Middle Ages, mistaken for a bearded woman. And an absurd legend was woven of a Portuguese princess who, rather than marry, prayed that she might become repulsive. A beard, accordingly, grew on her face in a single night, and her irritated father crucified her. That was one cross. The other cross was miraculous. It split itself, almost without human aid, out of the wood when it was being fashioned, and painter Wohankus adorned it, Gofrid the sacrist inlaid it with precious relics, and Anselm of Canterbury consecrated it soon after 1100. Somewhere near this was St. Peter's altar, and in his honour, no doubt, the vaulting was painted under Robert de Gravely about 1211 with circular medallions. In the first of these, Simon Magus was seen debating with Peter and Paul before Nero. In the second, Simon was borne up into the air by his familiar spirits, and then he fell at Peter's prayer. Next was the beheading of Paul, and last, the crucifixion of Peter. But we will now leave the choir, and we will enter the Lady Chapel. Here, there were several important tombs of the builder, Simon de Luton, of abbots Burnham and Brinkley, Prior Gosford and Thomas Beaufort. And there was also a great deal of imagery. In particular, a series of medallions of types and antitypes. Now, these are merely described as being at the altar of St. Mary, which could, of course, mean anything. But the verses on them are interesting because they show just how such things were borrowed. In several cases, and these are remarkable ones, they are taken from a series painted round the Norman chapter house at Worcester. Now, the paintings at Worcester are gone, but a full copy of the verses is in a 12th century manuscript there. The Bury artist, who must then be later, takes over the lines, describing pictures of Christ unveiling the synagogue and crowning the church, and also of Aaron's rod. The other Bury medallions had pictures of the visitation with the meeting of righteousness and peace, and of the nativity and its types, the burning bush, Gideon's fleece, the sign given by Ahaz by Isaiah. In the windows were scenes of the early gospel history, including the death of Herod. This is rare. When it does occur, we see Herod in bed, cutting his throat with a knife he'd asked someone to peel an apple with, and devils carrying off his soul. Then there were some of the famous miracles of the Virgin, how she rescued Theophilus, who had sold his soul to the devil, by summoning Satan and making him give up the bond. How she healed a sick clerk with her own milk, and how she saved a Jewish boy. This boy had joined some Christian children going to communion and had received the sacrament with them. His enraged father cast him into a heated oven, but he was found alive after many hours and said that a beautiful lady had thrown her robe about him and kept him safe. The father, of course, was put into the same oven but had no such happy exit. This famous miracle was also painted on the wall of the chapel. And with that, there was the tale of the monk who went out at night for evil purposes, fell into a river, and was pounced upon by devils, from whom the Virgin rescued him and sent him home. A tabula, perhaps the frontal of the altar, had Christ in majesty, surrounded by the evangelist and the four beasts. And allowing for the fact that we only know about pictures which happen to have verses on them, we may be sure that there was plenty more to admire in the Lady Chapel than I have mentioned. But alas, of course, like so much, it seems to have perished in 1465. Well, the most important part of the church that remains to be visited is the crypt, because I think we can neglect the vestry, which lay between the chapter house and the transept. I think that the crypt could be entered both from the north and south sides of the choir. What William of Worcester tells us of it is that it was 100 feet long by 80 feet broad, and that in it were 24 columns and a fair spring of water. It was dedicated to the Virgin, and it no doubt had an altar and imagery of its own, of which nothing is told us. But you see, it was the oldest part of the church, the substructure of Abbot Baldwin's great choir, and I really think that it could be cleared out. Years ago, I had a letter from old Mr. Beckford Bevan, in which he told me that in 1869 an excavation was made in the centre of the choir and a thin bed of concrete found at a depth of 11 feet. And since that date, nothing has been done. I mean, there have been hopes, but these have always been frustrated, some at the very last moment. And it is difficult to feel some impatience when one reflects that here is one of the most historic sites in England that is just asking to be investigated. I mean, the work carried out in the chapter house and its neighbourhood has been so good and its results so interesting that one cannot help asking for more. I mean, what will be found? You may ask, and that, of course, no one can predict, but I have always cherished the belief that the bones of St Edmund himself might have been decently buried there at the dissolution, because it seems to me that Henry VIII would not have smiled on the idea of a king's relics being scattered to the winds. But even short of that, the light that would be thrown on the plan of the church and the remains of carving that would undoubtedly turn up, the inscriptions that might be found, all these would amply repay the undertaking. And you see, what is now a very dull patch of grass would become a famous and interesting place. I believe that this piece of work is very well worth doing as anything in the country. But enough of the crypt. Now, we will mount the stairs into the church again. And besides all the beauties that I've already mentioned, we should find plenty to occupy us in another general exploration. We could go into the Triforium, in which were several altars and chapels of St Giles, St Anne, St Nicasius. We would find many a tomb of interest, that of Alan Fergont, Count of Brittany in the south transept, that of William Elman, who repulsed the King of Spain and relieved Bayonne, and somewhere the shrine of another Bury saint, the boy Robert, who was supposed to have been killed by the Jews of the town in the 12th century. Now, he was pretty evidently a copy of St William of Norwich. We don't have his full story, which Jocelyn de Bretland wrote, but Lydgate composed a page to him in verse, and a 15th century picture book shows us that an old woman hid his body in a well, and that a cock robin apparently played some role in the affair. Now, I imagine that Robert's cult was not very important, because it does not even find a place in the calendar, whereas William of Norwich is fairly frequent. In short, considered as an attraction, he was a failure. Now, we might look at the upstairs chapels now of St Catherine and St Faith at the West End, although I don't know what we would find there. St Faith, who was a southern French saint, had a fair number of dedications in England. There were chapels at St Paul's and Westminster Abbey, a priory at Horsham in Norfolk, and we also find her on some of our East Anglian rood screens. And you may yourselves have seen at the French exhibition the wonderful old image of her from the great treasury at Conques, set with ancient gems and looking every inch the barbaric idol. The bells, of course, might be a lure for some. There were many of them. How many at the time of the dissolution, I don't know, but there were 9 in the central tower which came crashing down in the Great Fire. There was a great bell called Gofrid, after the sacrist who gave it. The maker was Hailficus. 2 others were known as the Lutons, a Newport, a Clopton, a Gabriel, and a Haut Eclair. And one of these, at least, survived until after 1500 and was supposed to be the largest bell in England. Now, a moment in the cloister and about it, and another moment in the infirmary, and then I have done. Of the date of the cloister, 14th century, I've already spoken. The windows of it were glazed, but of what was in them, I only know that on the north side, by the lavatory troughs, were, once upon a time, 1 or more with pictures of the sun and moon, probably in chariots, and the occupations of the 12 months, of which 7 lines are preserved, showing that May was riding with a hawk on his hand, June was mowing, August reaping, September gathering grapes, October sowing, November killing pigs, and December feasting. The nearby refectory was no doubt splendid, and no doubt, like other refectories, had at its east end some important painting or sculpture, maybe a Last Supper, as at Dover, or a Majesty, as at Worcester. The tangle of foundations which has been uncovered beyond and beside the chapter house is, our current state of knowledge, absolutely impossible to unravel. Some of them must have had something to do with the vestry. Whether any fragment survives of the old round chapel of St Edmund, which was regarded as the most ancient piece of the building and was pulled down when the Lady Chapel was built, it's doubtful, but it is just conceivable. But a word more about this round chapel. John of Oxnead's chronicle tells us that when it was pulled down, the walls of another old round church were disclosed. Now, this was much broader than the chapel, and so built that the altar of the chapel was at about the centre of it, and it was thought to be that which was first of all built for St Edmund. Now, that is an interesting statement that I do not think has been much commented on. Is it wild to guess that there was once on this site a round church of 2 concentric circles, like that of Charlemagne of Aix, and that this was devastated by the Danes and only partly rebuilt, the inner side being retained as this old round chapel and the outer side levelled to the foundations? Now, well, we know that the Aix church was copied in other places, Chamonix in France, and even in England at Hereford, although admittedly not very closely. But anyway, that is guesswork. I mean, there is some chance, however, that if digging were carried out to the east, the site and plan of the infirmary might be ascertained, and the resting places of the earliest Abbot Uvius and the memorable Anselm, who did so much for the church, they are waiting to be discovered. There were seemingly in this chapel 3 altars, one of St Michael, to whom it was dedicated, one to St Benedict, and a 3rd nameless. The building had its own cloister, as was usual, another work of the liberal John Gosford in the 14th century. All of this, fortunately, survived the fire. But now, I've dragged you enough around the church. And with imaginary gazing up at windows and pictures and altars, your necks may well be stiff, your brains weary, and yourselves filled with self-pity. I mean, there's much else, of course, that I could have prosed upon. The library over the south walk of the cloister, its contents, a large fraction of which still exists among collections at Cambridge, Oxford, London, even Rome. The Vatican houses the earliest Bury Psalters. I've identified over 200 books. And at many a point I could have reminded you of interesting events and personalities, but no. I decided early in the day to eschew general history and to be almost purely antiquarian. My wish has been simply to impress upon you the ancient beauty and splendour of this great church, and the fact that in the unexplored ruins of it, you have the happiest hunting ground for the historian and antiquary that is to be found in the length and breadth of England. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was brilliant. Just a few thanks. Thanks to Richard Hoggett. I got it right this time. It won't surprise you that we've got no question and answers tonight, not without the power of a Ouija board. So I think both speakers have said that they're quite willing to answer any questions afterwards. So if you'd like to buttonhole them afterwards, I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you. I'd like to thank again the Bury Society for their very generous sponsorship of tonight's event. I'd like to thank the people who've worked so hard behind the scenes to bring about the event, particularly Carol Roundtree, who's done some tremendous work, Mark Beaumont, who's done our video recording, our volunteer stewards, and of course the Apex staff, who've been very helpful to us. And finally, of course, thanks to you, the audience, for coming along and making this what I think has been a really memorable occasion. Thank you very much.